The winter of 1882 hit Wyoming territory like a sledgehammer to the chest, bringing with it the kind of cold that could freeze a man's breath before it left his lungs. Most folks had the good sense to stay close to their hearths when the wind started howling like that. But not everyone gets to choose when they travel, and not everyone gets to choose when they need help. What happened on that bitter February night along the old cattle trail would change 2 lives forever and reshape the entire balance of power in Silver Creek Valley. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I always love hearing from folks all around the world. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the landscape into an endless sea of white that stretched from horizon to horizon. The kind of storm that made landmarks disappear and turned familiar trails into death traps. Most sensible people had battened down the hatches and were waiting it out by their fires. But Jake Morrison wasn't most people. He was stubborn, broke, and had promised to deliver 12 head of cattle to the railroad depot in Cheyenne by week's end, storm or no storm. Jake pulled his collar up against the driving wind and squinted through the swirling snow. At 24, he'd already spent half his life working other men's ranches, moving cattle, and scraping together enough money to maybe, someday, own a piece of land he could call his own. His horse, a steady sorrel mare named Duchess, picked her way carefully through the deepening drifts, her breath forming clouds of steam that were instantly swept away by the relentless wind. The cattle moved in a tight bunch ahead of him, their heads down against the storm, following the lead steer with the kind of blind faith that comes from having no other choice. Jake had been pushing them hard for the better part of 2 days, hoping to reach the old way station at Bear Creek before the worst of the weather hit. But the storm had come faster and harder than anyone had predicted, and now he was fighting just to keep moving forward. That's when he saw her. At first it was just a dark shape against the white, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow. Jake might have mistaken it for a fallen log or a snow-covered boulder if it hadn't been for the way it moved, just slightly, like someone trying to wave but lacking the strength to lift their arm more than a few inches. He urged Duchess toward the figure, his heart sinking as he realized what he was looking at. A woman, dressed in what had once been fine traveling clothes, now soaked through and crusted with ice. She was huddled against the base of a large pine tree, her face pale as winter moonlight, her lips already showing the telltale blue of someone who didn't have much time left. Jake dismounted without hesitation, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached her. She looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She was older than him, maybe 30 or so, with dark hair that had escaped from what had probably been an elegant arrangement hours earlier. Even half frozen and exhausted, there was something about her bearing, something in the way she held herself, that spoke of breeding and education. "Ma'am," Jake said, pulling off his heavy coat without thinking about it. "How long have you been out here?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from cold and exhaustion. "Since yesterday morning. My carriage. The wheel broke my driver. He tried to fix it, but then the storm got worse. He went for help and..." She trailed off, her eyes closing as if the effort of speaking was too much. Jake looked around, searching for any sign of the carriage or driver she'd mentioned, but the storm had already covered any tracks that might have been there. He draped his coat around her shoulders, noting how she barely had the strength to hold it closed. "Can you ride?" he asked, though he could see the answer in her face. She was in no condition to sit a horse, especially not in weather like this. The woman shook her head weakly. I can't feel my feet anymore." Jake's mind raced. He had 12 head of cattle depending on him, a contract that would pay him enough to finally make a down payment on that piece of land he'd been dreaming about. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and every moment they delayed was another step closer to losing the whole herd. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to get her up on Duchess and head for the nearest shelter, leaving the cattle to fend for themselves. But one look at her face told him she wouldn't survive a hard ride through this storm. She needed warmth, shelter, and she needed it now. "All right," he said, more to himself than to her. We're going to get you somewhere safe." What Jake couldn't have known as he made that decision was that he wasn't just saving a stranger's life. He was about to discover that the woman shivering in his coat was Catherine Whitmore, daughter of railroad magnate Harrison Whitmore. And through a series of complicated inheritances and business arrangements, the legal owner of nearly half of Silver Creek Valley, including most of the prime grazing land that every rancher in the territory had been fighting over for years. But in that moment, all Jake saw was someone who needed help, and that was enough. He whistled sharply to his cattle dog, Rex, who came bounding through the snow with his tail wagging despite the conditions. "Keep them bunched up, boy," Jake called, gesturing toward the cattle. "We're not going far, but we need to find shelter." Jake scooped Catherine up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, and settled her carefully onto Duchess's back. She slumped forward, barely conscious, and he had to hold her steady with one arm while he grabbed the reins with the other. The cattle, sensing the change in routine, began to mill about nervously, but Rex darted back and forth, keeping them moving in the right direction. Through the swirling snow, Jake remembered an old line shack he'd used before, maybe half a mile off the main trail. It wasn't much more than 4 walls and a roof, but it would keep the wind off, and there might even be some firewood left from the last cowboy who'd sheltered there. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. The storm seemed to be getting stronger, the wind driving the snow horizontal across the landscape. Jake's face was numb, his hands aching from the cold even through his gloves. The woman in his arms had stopped shivering, which worried him more than if she'd been shaking like a leaf. When the dark outline of the line shack finally appeared through the storm, Jake felt a relief so intense it was almost physical. He guided Duchess up to the door, then carefully lifted Catherine down, noting that she was barely responsive now. The door stuck from the cold and accumulated snow, but Jake put his shoulder to it and forced it open. Inside, the shack was dark and cold, but it was shelter. There was even a small pile of split wood near the stone fireplace, left by some previous occupant who understood the unwritten code of the frontier. Always leave something for the next person who might need it. Jake settled Catherine onto the single bunk in the corner, then quickly set about building a fire. His hands shook from cold as he struck the match, but soon flames were crackling in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. As warmth began to fill the small space, the woman's eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confused, then focused on Jake as he knelt beside the bunk. "You saved my life," she said simply. Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her voice. Anyone would have done the same, but they both knew that wasn't true. In country this harsh, in weather this dangerous, most people would have made the practical choice, the safe choice. What neither of them realized yet was that this single act of kindness was about to change everything. Catherine tried to sit up, wincing as feeling began to return to her extremities. The warmth from the fire was already making a difference, though Jake could see she was still dangerously cold. Her fine traveling dress was soaked through, and he realized she needed dry clothes if she was going to make it through the night. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be forward, but you need to get out of those wet things," Jake said, turning his back to give her privacy while he rummaged through an old chest in the corner. "There might be something in here that'll work." He found a worn flannel shirt and a pair of canvas pants, probably left by some cowhand who'd used the shack during roundup. They'd be too big for her, but they were dry, and that's what mattered. He set them on the bunk beside her and moved to tend the fire, keeping his back turned. "Thank you," Catherine whispered, her voice still weak but steadier now. After a few minutes, she spoke again. "I'm decent." Jake turned to find her swimming in the oversized clothes, the sleeves rolled up several times, the pants cinched with a piece of rope he'd found. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the circumstances, there was still something dignified about the way she carried herself. "Better?" he asked, settling cross-legged on the floor near the fire. She nodded, pulling the blanket he'd given her tighter around her shoulders. "Much. I thought I was going to die out there." "You might have," Jake said honestly. Storm like this, it doesn't give second chances. Outside, the wind howled around the small shack, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the windows. The cattle would be huddled together somewhere nearby, probably in the shelter of the trees. Rex would stay with them, keeping watch. It wasn't ideal, but they were hardy animals. They'd weather the storm better than a human would. "I haven't properly introduced myself," Catherine said, extending a hand that was finally showing some color. "Catherine Whitmore." Jake shook her hand, noting the softness of her palm, so different from his own work-roughened skin. "Jake Morrison, ma'am, and you don't need to be formal with me." "Catherine, then." She studied his face in the firelight. "You gave up something important to help me, didn't you? Those cattle outside, they're not just animals to you." Jake poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up the chimney. "They're my future, I suppose, or they were supposed to be. Got a contract to deliver them to Cheyenne by Friday. Money from that job would have been enough to put a down payment on some land. And now," Jake shrugged, "now we're here, and they're out in the storm, might lose some of them. Might lose them all if this weather keeps up." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance. "Why did you stop? Most men would have kept riding." "Most men didn't see you out there. But those who did might have made a different choice." Jake met her eyes across the fire. "Maybe. But I couldn't live with myself if I'd left you to die for the sake of a few head of cattle. Money's just money, a person's life. That's something else entirely." Something shifted in Catherine's expression, a look Jake couldn't quite read. You might be surprised how few people think that way, especially when there's profit at stake. The fire crackled between them, and Jake found himself studying this woman who'd appeared out of the storm like something from a dream. Everything about her spoke of a world he'd never known. From the way she spoke, educated and refined, to the quality of the jewelry she still wore despite her bedraggled state. The watch chain visible beneath the oversized shirt was gold, real gold. Not the brass that most folks made do with. "What were you doing out here?" Jake asked. "This isn't exactly traveling weather, and it's not country for someone. Well, someone like you." Catherine's smile was sad. "Someone like me? You mean someone foolish enough to think they could travel in February without checking the weather? I mean someone who looks like they're more comfortable in a parlor than on a cattle trail." "You're not wrong." She pulled the blanket closer. "I was coming back from Denver. Had some business to attend to there, legal matters. My driver assured me we could make the trip before the storm hit." She shook her head. "I should have listened to the warnings and waited." "Legal matters?" Jake asked, then immediately felt foolish for prying. "Sorry, not my business." "It's all right. Family affairs. My father passed recently, and there were complications with his estate. Things that needed to be sorted out in person." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of family obligations, even if he didn't understand the world of legal complications and estates. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Catherine stared into the fire. He was a complicated man. Successful, but complicated. Sometimes I think his business dealings created more problems than they solved. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the little shack. The wind had picked up even more, and Jake could hear branches snapping under the weight of ice and snow. This was shaping up to be one of the worst blizzards he'd seen in years. "We might be here a while," Jake said, glancing toward the window where snow was piling up against the glass. "This doesn't look like it's letting up anytime soon." Catherine nodded. "I'm grateful for the shelter and the company." She paused. "Jake, what you did today, stopping for a stranger, giving up your business obligations, that says something about who you are." "Says I'm probably not cut out for business," Jake replied with a wry smile. "No, it says you understand that some things are more important than profit." Catherine's voice grew serious. "You'd be surprised how rare that is, especially in my world." Jake fed another log to the fire, wondering what world she meant exactly. The way she talked, the clothes she'd been wearing before they got soaked, the gold jewelry. It all pointed to wealth, real wealth. But there was something else. Something in the way she carried herself, even in borrowed clothes, that suggested she was accustomed to being in charge. "Your world?" he asked. Catherine hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Business, finance, the kind of world where decisions are made based on ledger books rather than human decency. Sounds lonely? It can be." She looked at him across the fire. "But it's also the world that built the railroads, opened up the territories, created opportunities for people to make new lives." Jake thought about that. The railroad had certainly changed everything in Wyoming territory. Brought in settlers, made it possible to move cattle to market, connected isolated communities to the rest of the country. But it had also brought speculators, land grabbers, and the kind of money that could push out small ranchers who'd been working the land for years. "I suppose that's true," he said carefully. "Though it's also brought its share of problems." "Such as?" Jake chose his words thoughtfully. "Well, take Silver Creek Valley, for instance. Used to be open range, free grazing for anyone who needed it. Now there's talk of it all being bought up by some Eastern investors, fenced off, turned into private holdings. Small ranchers like me, we're getting squeezed out." Catherine went very still. "Silver Creek Valley? You know it." I've heard of it." Her voice was cautious now, guarded. "It's supposed to be good grazing land. Best in the territory," Jake confirmed. "My dream was always to own a piece of it someday, build a small ranch, run a few hundred head of cattle. Nothing fancy, just enough to make an honest living." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Course, the way land prices are going up, that dream's getting further away every year." Catherine stared into the flames, her knuckles white where she gripped the blanket. Something had changed in her demeanor, a tension that hadn't been there moments before Jake noticed it immediately. The way her breathing had become more shallow, the way she seemed to be choosing her words with extreme care. "What kind of investors?" she asked quietly. Jake shrugged, poking at the fire again. "Nobody knows for sure. Word is it's some big Eastern money. Railroad connections, maybe folks are saying. Whoever it is has been buying up land through intermediaries, shell companies, that sort of thing, keeping their identity secret while they piece together the whole valley. And what do the local ranchers think about that? What do you think they think?" Jake's voice carried a bitter edge. "Most of them have been working that land for years, some for decades. Their fathers and grandfathers drove cattle through those valleys when it was still Indian territory. Now some faceless corporation wants to come in and fence it all off, probably raise the grazing fees so high that only the big operations can afford it." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. What if the new owners had good intentions? What if they wanted to improve the land, make it more productive? Jake looked at her sharply. There was something in her tone, something that made him wonder why she was so interested in this particular topic. Improve it for who? The land's been productive for centuries. The buffalo knew how to use it, the Indians knew how to use it, and the ranchers know how to use it. When rich folks start talking about improvement, it usually means making things better for themselves and worse for everybody else. But surely there's room for compromise, ways to make changes that benefit everyone. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you sound like someone who's never had to worry about where your next meal was coming from." Jake's voice was gentle but firm. When you're working 16-hour days just to keep food on the table, when you're one bad winter away from losing everything, compromise usually means giving up what little you have to someone who already has plenty. Catherine flinched as if he'd struck her. She turned away from the fire, staring at the snow-covered window. "You're right, of course. I don't know what it's like to struggle like that." Jake immediately felt bad for his harsh words. "I'm sorry, Catherine. I didn't mean to sound bitter. It's just, this valley means everything to the people who live here. It's not just land to them. It's home, it's livelihood, it's legacy. When outside money comes in and starts changing things, folks get scared." "I understand." Her voice was small, distant, more than you might think. The wind outside had reached a howling crescendo, rattling the entire structure of the little shack. Jake added another log to the fire, grateful for the warmth but worried about how long their supply of wood would last. Through the window, he could see that the snow was now nearly halfway up the glass. They were well and truly snowed in Jake. Catherine said suddenly, "What would you do if you found out that someone you'd helped, someone you'd saved, was connected to the very thing that was threatening your way of life?" The question was so specific, so pointed, that Jake turned to look at her fully. "That's an odd question. Just hypothetically." Jake considered it, studying her face in the firelight. Something was definitely troubling her, something more than just gratitude for being rescued. "Well, I suppose it would depend on the person, and on what they intended to do with that connection. But you'd feel betrayed." "Betrayed? No, I don't think so. A person can't help who they're connected to, can they? Family, business partners, that sort of thing. What matters is what they choose to do with whatever power or influence they have." Catherine nodded slowly, as if weighing his words carefully. And if that person wanted to make things right, to use their position to help rather than hurt, then I'd say they should do it. But they'd have to be prepared for folks not to trust them at first. People around here have been burned by promises before. The conversation lapsed into silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the relentless howling of the wind. Jake found himself watching Catherine more carefully now, noting the way she seemed to be wrestling with some internal conflict. There was more to her story than she was letting on. That much was clear. "Catherine," he said gently, "is there something you want to tell me?" She met his eyes for a moment, then looked away. "What makes you ask that?" "The way you've been talking about Silver Creek Valley, like it's personal to you somehow." Catherine was quiet for so long that Jake began to think she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the storm. "My father, his business interests were extensive. Railroad development, land acquisition, mining rights. He believed in progress, in bringing civilization to the frontier." Jake felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "What kind of land acquisition?" "The kind that involved buying up large tracts of territory for development." She looked at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Jake, my father's company, we own most of Silver Creek Valley." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He sat back on his heels, staring at her in disbelief. The woman he'd risked everything to save, the woman whose life he'd put above his own future, was part of the very force that threatened to destroy everything he'd worked for. "You're one of them," he said quietly. "One of the Eastern investors. I inherited my father's holdings when he died. I didn't ask for them, didn't even know the full extent of what he owned until the lawyers in Denver explained it to me." Catherine's voice was urgent now, pleading. "I came out here to see the land for myself, to try to understand what my father had built and what I was supposed to do with it." Jake stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Through the snow-covered glass, he could barely make out the shapes of his cattle huddled under the trees. Those 12 head represented months of work, careful saving, planning for a future that now seemed more impossible than ever. "So you own it all," he said, not turning around. "The grazing rights, the water access, everything." "Most of it, yes." "And what's your plan? Fence it off? Raise the fees? Push out all the small ranchers who've been working that land for years?" "I don't know." Catherine's voice broke slightly. "I honestly don't know. That's why I was coming back from Denver. I've been meeting with lawyers, accountants, trying to understand what my options are. Sometimes the most important decisions we make happen in moments when we think nobody's watching." Jake Morrison stopped for a stranger in a blizzard because it was the right thing to do, never knowing that single act of compassion would change the fate of an entire valley. Because when we choose humanity over profit, when we see people instead of obstacles, we don't just save lives. We save our own souls in the process.